Welcome back to Planet Vero Radio and the Story of Liberty with your host, John Bona.
Welcome back. Welcome back with Marshall and Dan. I'm John Bona, your host. We're talking about separation of church and state and asking the question, how did we get here? And what happened all the way from the founding of this great nation back in Plymouth Rock until 2011? And who's responsible? You know, there's a lot of blame out there. Is it the ACLU or the People for the American Way that we laid the blame on? Let me share with you a story. You probably remember the story. And I'm sure some of you, this will spark an old memory of Dr. Frankenstein and his famous monster. I remember watching that when I was a kid. But just imagine, if you will, the final scene when the monster has gone berserk and he's wreaked havoc on the townspeople and he's left numbers of people dead. Now he attacks his master and has destroyed the home, which is now ablaze and setting the sky alight with flames. And about that time, a friend of Dr. Frankenstein's arrives from a distant city and sees the carnage and the chaos. And he says, "Dr. Frankenstein, what has happened here?" And Dr. Frankenstein replies, "A monster, a monster, a monster did this. It was terrible. He just went berserk. He killed people and he destroyed the home." And the friend exclaims, "A monster? Where did this monster come from?" Silence. "Where did it come from, Dr. Frankenstein?" "Well, I made it myself," he replies. In case you don't see the application, my friends, we have to acknowledge a great deal of the blame must rest upon us, must be laid on Christians at the doorstep of the church. We have failed in a large way to obey the Great Commission in this country as a whole. We failed to obey the cultural mandate to be involved in every sphere of activity. We've retreated. Christians have, in general, retreated from politics, government, media, higher education, and we've left it to the unbelievers. We fail to fulfill our responsibilities as citizens. We fail to obey the commandment of Christ himself, who said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." Now, we didn't create this monster, I'll agree there, with our own hands, but we've allowed it to grow up among us. With the power of government, colleges, liberal colleges, the media, the courts, I said, as legislatures, it's wreaked disaster and this carnage that we have in America today. So what I'm saying is, I think we must realize and look in the mirror here that much of the blame really rests on us. Christians have failed to fulfill their responsibilities as citizens in this country. We've allowed this great blessing of a godly nation that we once had to slip through our hands. And Marshall, I would like to ask you, I know you've been a Christian historian for 30 years. You have seen this really develop, haven't you?
Well, yeah, I really have. And you've seen a slide going back as far as 45 years ago when we started our ministry, where basically the Christian folk in America kind of disassociated themselves in the 20th century from involvement in society. They did some, but for the most part, they began to give over their children to the public schools. They began to give over charity, beginning with Roosevelt and ending with the 1960s welfare state, and now it's grown into a situation where half the people in America are dependent upon government welfare. And so what we have is a situation in which we have not obeyed Christ's statement when he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, but render unto God the things that are God. There are limited jurisdictions given by God in the Word for civil government. Civil government has the right and responsibility to lay taxes for specific purposes, especially for protecting the citizenry against attack. That is the purpose of civil government, is to punish evildoers, according to Romans 13 and according to Genesis 9. But Jesus was saying in that passage, he said, oh, here's a coin. What's on this coin? Oh, it's Caesar's head. Oh, give that coin to Caesar. That is his due in terms of a poll tax or a tax. But what he said, he turned to the people and said, render unto God the things that are God's. And what he's saying is that God owns it all. He owns everything, including Caesar. But the truth is that he is telling the people, listen, render your souls, render your families, render your property, render all that you have unto God, because he is going to hold you accountable for that. And we as American Christians, as American citizens, have got to hold our government's feet to the fire to only do the things that they're called to do in Scripture. And at the other side is that we've got to be involved. If we don't want a welfare state, then we need to be the benevolent citizens. Right now we're facing a huge crisis down in the South with the largest tornadoes that have gone through there probably forever. And places like Alabama are devastated with 100-mile swaths of entire civilization wiped from the face of the earth. And who is down there? Well, people like the Samaritan's Purse and Christian Ministries and of course the Salvation Army and others. They're down there, but we need to be there helping people rebuild their homes and loving our neighbor as ourselves. This is the real sign. In fact, Daniel Webster said it well. One of our great founding fathers in the second generation said, let the religious element of a man's nature be neglected, and he becomes the creature of selfish passion. The cultivation of the religious sentiment incites a general benevolence. In other words, what he's saying is if we will build our faith in Christ, then we will want to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we will give ourselves to that. And the result is the people around will say, I want Christian leadership. I want these people. These people love me. They care for me when I'm in need. They're really not trying to force their agenda on me. They simply are trying to show me that God really does make a difference in society as well as in one's individual life. That's really the hope of America, is for the church to arise and be the church and to live out the great principles of Christ in our society.
I agree, Marshall. I agree. No, Dan, I was just going to invite you to you and I were talking about pietism the other day, and I was going to ask you about that.
Well, you're absolutely right. I'm going to add one more thing to what Marshall said about whose image and inscription is on this coin. Remember, the Pharisees of that day were the money collectors appointed by the Romans. And so they were very directly threatened by Jesus' teaching of the proper sovereignties, which means the people would once again take care of the poor, etc. And that actual Greek translation of whose image is on this coin is whose image is superimposed on this coin. So when he's holding up Caesar's face, he's really saying whose image is superimposed over Caesar. And that's why he called them hypocrites. In other words, God owned it all. And that's why we come back to this issue of pietism, which is a Neoplatonic view of Christianity, that somehow we're separated into spirit and materialism, but really coming down to those ethics that we have, that we get someplace. Remember, morals are the way things are, and ethics are the way things ought to be. So these ethics, which we as Christians should be drawing from biblical ethics for every area of life, they need to be going forward and transforming the culture in every single area. Jesus always said, come follow me. It's every other theology says, come follow me or else. It was always a choice to move forward with blessings and cursings. That's the Deuteronomy 27 through 29, which we were studying last night, my son and I. But that's the point. We have to bring our Christian principles to bear in every area of life, and that's how the culture is transformed. And that's how we become, we make these transitions from a victim to a dominion victor, where we see there's a victory, and where we have a generational view. We are true statesmen. We are producers, not consumers. We experience the joy of watching our children read for the very first time, or our son or daughter getting excited about tearing a motor apart and realizing how it worked. We are there and engaged directly rather than having hirelings, which is the common system today. We have hirelings to do everything, and nobody is the shepherd. And we need to have a concept that a father is a priest of his home. He is the shepherd of his home. And 20 fathers gather and become shepherds and priests of a community. And that concept's got to come back. We've let Greek theology and philosophy change us. And that's why we're struggling. And I think Marshall hit it right on the head, and you did too, John. You really hit it. It sits right at the feet of Christians and the church, and we need to, in a strong and a straightforward way, begin reasserting those principles in every single area of life, making great Christian movies, having great Christian talk shows, having Christian economics. We were studying economics last night, my son and I, and studying John Keynes, and reaffirming those Christian principles.
In this program, the story of liberty, we also talk and show examples of the loss of liberty. And we see how rampant this was in the 1920s in Germany. There was a pietistic movement that had become very big at that time. People didn't engage the culture or the politics. It's a fact of history. They didn't want to be concerned what was happening out there. They just didn't want to know what was going on out there. They just wanted to live their lives. They hardly noticed when somebody named Adolf began to move into prominence and take over. In 1917, while the revolution was getting started in the streets of Moscow, a gathering group of bishops from the Russian Orthodox Church got together from all over the country. They had this big meeting, and they were engaged in this great controversy. See, they didn't even know what was going on outside. You see, they were debating, and this is a fact, what color of vestments they should wear. Now, if that isn't an example of a pietistic religion, and what happens, piety is good, devotion to religion, don't get me wrong. But pietism is not. Because, for example, they never engage the culture. They don't get involved. And I think it's what Dr. Francis Schaeffer, I know you knew him, Marshall, he called that a false spirituality, a false Christianity, right?
Exactly. It's an otherworldliness, You're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good, and that's where many of the Christians find themselves today. And we've got to become earthly good. That's why we're here, is to manifest the love of God to our culture and to the people around us.
But, speaking about getting back to the separation of church and state, and I'd like you guys to weigh in more here, I always thought of the example right here. I think it was in Vero Beach a few years ago. A high school valedictorian wanted to express his or her viewpoint at her graduation speech. And it was, she was a Christian. And somehow, I don't know if it was actually in Vero, maybe outside of the county, but they stopped her. And I thought, man, that's not only a wrongfully restricting her individual freedom of speech. It actually goes to that. And that's how far this has drifted. When a child in high school who has a deep, genuine Christian faith and is a valedictorian chosen by the student body and would like to share their faith at one of probably the biggest events of their life in front of their peers at a graduation class, is stopped. And that's not the nature of a free society, is it, Marshall?
Well, exactly. It's not. And the only reason that this is manifest in our Christian civilization is because we, the biblically based people in our country, have simply ignored our responsibilities to live it out and have allowed a small minority of people to lie about this idea of separation of church and state. A good illustration of this is to look at what's going on in Pakistan right now, and you look at the death of this monster over there that was shot in the head.
Yep.
That's a wonderful thing. Bin Laden is no longer finding his dreams of a better life in heaven. He's, I'm sure, facing something much worse than that. But just to look at the two cultures and think, which culture do you want to live in? A society where a bunch of Christian men, 40 of them, go over there to risk their lives to take out a murderer. Those are the Navy SEALs. Most of these men are Christian men. You look at the armed forces, the vast majority of these people that are working there are men that are based their lives upon the faith.
Yep.
And the faith that man is equal before God and that every individual is important. They went out after that guy because they did not want more of their citizens, after 3,000 had already died, to be taken down by this guy. And that was not a secular act. That was the act of men and women who understood that there is a biblical foundation to life, liberty, property in America.
And you know, John, when we think about the struggle we have, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and many of the theologians in Germany were asked, how in the world did the German people sink so low? How could they seriously allow a man like Hitler to rise to power? How could they allow the Dusseldorf Bible to be written, which had all kinds of apostasy in it? And the answers were interesting. They just didn't believe it could happen. They just did not believe that in their culture this kind of evil person could be propagated to leadership. And when I was reading about Keynesian economics last night, the same thing comes out of John Keynes. They asked him, what happens when the money supply inflates to the point where it doesn't work? He said, don't worry about it. We'll all be dead anyway. There's an apathy that can settle in a loss of vision that's long-term. And, you know, there's this huge dichotomy between these men and women in arms that are defending and protecting their wives, their children, their husbands in some cases, our way of life, and an apathy that's brewing in the background. I mean, talk about an extreme dichotomy of ideas. These men and women putting their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor on the line to protect us. And then we have people, like we saw these protests in Wisconsin, where there's an apathy about making God take care of us. And I think that's something that has to be resolved so the nation can move forward. And it's going to be resolved by people, once again, putting biblical ethics and principles in every area of life and not separating themselves from the culture or allowing the culture, meaning the government or some judge, to separate you out. That young lady probably should have spoke her piece at that graduating event. She had every right to.
Well, I think she wanted to. They turned the mic off. You know,
okay.
And this, you know, this exclude Christianity view, it's never been adopted by the American people through any democratic process. It's being imposed on our nation by the exercise of raw judicial power by the courts, and especially by the Supreme Court. And it's been an increasing problem for the last several decades in America. And, you know, we have to ask the question, what can we do? What could we do? Well, look, for sure in the next presidential election, there's going to be one or two Supreme Court justices appointed. And what happens at that point in time can determine a lot of issues. And I know right now we have a kind of a shaky 5-4 balance again, I guess. And it seems to me that Kennedy is the swing vote. Again, I read an article that he is arguably the most powerful man in the world because the four are always on one side, the other four on the other, and he kind of is the swing vote. But we don't know the numbers, what they are in the future. But I personally, I'd like to see an 8-1 balance and have Christians in there. And boy, what a transformation of the American society that would just make from what we see taking place in this country today. Now, I'm not putting all the blame on the Supreme Court, but let's face it, a lot of it rests right there. I think if we could see a change in this court, we'd see a change in this nation beyond the imagination of most people.
Right, and that must happen with a change in the hearts of our people, because we've got to begin to understand and vote upon the truths and principles that are eternal, and stop voting for personalities, stop voting for parties, and start voting for men of character, true statesmen who will stand for these values and the constitutional values of our forefathers. And if we will do that, then there's great hope. But Ronald Reagan said it well in 1984, and
Well, we lost Marshall again, and so Dan and I will finish up here. And but what can we do? That's what we're talking about, Dan. And Christians have had it in their power to change all these things that we lament and complain about and grumble about constantly, and we just haven't done it. And but I think the good news is we can change America. Because let's remember one important point. People made America what it is today, and we can make it what it ought to be. We can really do that, and the Apostle Paul reminded us of that simple quote in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ. And remember those men who worked and pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, to produce this great country. They were willing to sacrifice everything, and that's what Marshall would say if he's here. And many gave their lives that we might enjoy the freedoms, the liberty, and the blessings of this nation. But folks, we're letting it slip through our fingers like sand. I wonder.
John,
go ahead, Dan.
You are right on something there that I think everybody's got get their hands around. We can talk about not voting ourselves largest from the Treasury by voting for certain politicians that will give us the goodies that we want. But the reality is this whole thing is in God's hands. And God's looking for His people to obey and do the things that He has told us to do, to remember the first things and do them again. And that really leads us back to implementing the Bible in every area of our life in our own homes. And that's the first test. And Reagan said it, I'm sure Marshall was going there, that it's going to happen at the kitchen table. It's Mom, Dad, you got to sit around that table and you got to start to talk about these principles in detail. And if you don't know, you have to have the courage to go start teaching yourselves and turn the TV off and start studying those deeper things that transform your home. And that's a challenge, and it's not easy because there are a million distractions.
Yep, absolutely.
Every day.
There are, and I think that's a great message, Dan. And, I wonder what many people will have to say to their grandchildren or their children when they ask, Granddaddy, where were you when America was losing its freedom, its liberty? What were you doing? What were you doing when America became a godless nation? What did you do to stop that, Granddaddy? Well, we can't stop it, and we could change it for good if we will simply be obedient to what you just said, Dan, to Christ, and what He told us to do and fulfill our responsibilities as Christian citizens. I know it's my dream. I know it's yours. And I believe it's possible with all my heart. And I hope you believe it as well, that we can see a nation where babies can be conceived and born without the fear of being hacked to pieces in their mother's womb, where this tremendous, vile ocean of pornography can be cleaned up and removed, and we can go to a film without worrying about what's contained in it, where we can turn our TVs on and not expect to hear the name of Christ taken in vain, and all sorts of other bad things. And we can have a society where drugs are not rampant, where it's safe to walk the streets at night again. Well, we're going to finish up here. Thank you, Dan. God bless you. We'll see you next week, Monday night at 6 p.m., The Story of Liberty.